Howard, I really appreciate you coming to talk with us today and sharing your perspectives on cybersecurity. This is an audience that will be rapt with attention, and you have a lot of experience to share with us. And speaking of that, many of us know you as having been the cybersecurity czar or the special assistant to the president for cybersecurity in the first Obama administration, and you're now doing many other things as well. But what's interesting to me is you bridge both public and private positions. And would you mind just sharing a little bit about your background, your highlights, what's contributed to your perspectives?
Well, I'm happy to, and it's great to be back here, and I can't thank you and University of Washington enough for allowing me to sit here and have this conversation with you. It means a lot. As you know, this is one of the most important topics that we see today. We've talked about it with world leaders around the world, with students, with business owners, and it's a great opportunity, I think, to really share some things with each other. So the background is kind of a mixed bag. It's kind of interesting. I spent my first 7 years out of school in the military, did 3 tours in Southeast Asia. Later on, went back to work for the Air Force, became a policeman, which is sort of where the first piece came in to what we now call computer crime. I love technology. I'm a ham radio operator. I used to build my own equipment back in the 60s and 70s. But when I became a policeman, I identified that the cyber criminals were just beginning to get active. In those days, it wasn't the internet. It was bulletin board systems. And we saw everything from credit card fraud to child pornography. And the thing was, with the technology background that I had, it was an easy thing to say, okay, let's apply that technology to investigating computer crime. And went from there, working with the FBI, running their computer exploitation team, ultimately as the director of computer crime and information warfare for Air Force Office of Special Investigations, which was kind of really the first big piece of it when you start to see other countries, criminal hackers, individual people that were within an organization that were using technology to commit crimes. Later on, I came out here, the Pacific Northwest, which I've been trying to get to for years. Took over as the Director of Information Security for Microsoft and ultimately became the CSO and the security strategist for Microsoft. September 11th happened, as I think many of us have. We're looking for ways to contribute. I was appointed by President Bush as the Vice Chairman of the President's Critical Infrastructure Protection Board, with the concept that technology runs so much of what we do on a day-to-day basis. Clearly, all the critical parts of our economy, our government, our law enforcement depend on ICT systems. So spent some time there. The big ticket item was writing the national strategy to secure cyberspace. Came back, took a little bit of a twist, went to eBay, actually commuted from here at home in Pacific Northwest, became the Vice President of Information Security for eBay. A lot of fun, but it was also one of those companies that was an easy job. Got out, started doing some consulting, eventually became the CEO of the Information Security Forum, a really great nonprofit based in London that looked at the corporate side of things, working with many corporations. A vast majority were half of the Fortune 500 companies. And then, of course, President Obama asked me to come back and be the special assistant to the president and cybersecurity coordinator for the president, looking how do we bring all these pieces together? How do we bring in academia, private sector? How do we bring in the governments, not only domestically but internationally? How do we tie all these pieces together so we've got the right workforce development? We're fighting those that are looking to affect negatively our cyber systems, but on the same token be able to build the economy and build new jobs based on this great technology. And today, my former colleague at the White House in the first time, Tom Ridge, and I run our own consulting company looking to deal with CEOs and board of directors, recognizing we have tremendous talent out there that have been well trained. Now we need to make sure they have the executive support. And as a side job, if I could, as executive director of SafeCode, which is the Software Assurance Forum for Excellence in Code, Microsoft, Siemens, SAP, Adobe, big companies coming together to share information, how to write more secure computer programs in the future.
Wow, that's an interesting background, Howard. what impresses me is that you have been at the top of decision making in both the public and the private sector, and there are differences between the two. In the industrial age, we perfectly siloed things. So we have the government sector, the private sector, the military, but now the internet connects all of these things. And yet, to get people aboard information security is different in all of those sectors. So what is your reflection on that, having been in many different camps?
Yeah, I think for the first thing, the technology that we look at that not only supports the information that we live by today, but to help secure that information is pretty consistent from private sector to public sector to academia. I think the major difference that we see is the way business decisions are made. In the government, as I've said a million times, we operate at government speed, not the internet speed. There is a very complex three-part government that we deal with: legislative, judicial, and the executive branch. And that itself, for governance and for democracy, works great. Not so much when we start looking at technology, particularly is how do we deal with technology that's under siege in many cases. There's also the piece that we look at is what are the laws that we need? What are the executive branch roles and responsibilities are? But the bigger piece, and this is something we've been struggling with since 1998, when President Clinton put together a presidential decision directive, an executive order that said we need private sector working with the government. Learning what the roles are, learning what the private sector needs that helps foster business to help us continue on, while still making sure government can help protect the people and fight crime as they're supposed to do. So those are some big differences, but on the private sector side, we're more nimble. We have a tendency to be able to take new technology, roll it out quicker, see the benefits of it, and especially see the economic benefits of it. Challenges both sides have is getting the right people in the workforce that can help us with those really critical tasks that we need to do for information security and using that technology.
So what are the challenges that you see in addition to what you've just described in the private sector, Howard, in terms of getting all of those myriads of companies and organizations aboard and convinced that there truly is a problem?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges we see is when you start looking at the speed we operate in private sector. You know, we've talked for a long time as in private sector, you really create some really rich, robust applications or software. The idea is be the first to market, get it out quickly, and then later on come back and fix it. And that's one of the things. So our ability to move forward very quickly is also the challenge we have, because oftentimes we put things out that aren't fully tested to work in a really high threat environment that we see today. Whether it goes back to the early days of servers or PCs or laptops, mobile devices, even watches today that we see. We have to not slow things down, but have things built in right from the very outset that are sensitive to security and privacy needs.
So we're moving into this brave new world of the cloud. I've actually had someone say to me, we've solved our problems now because we're moving everything to the cloud. How do you see the cloud in its relationship to information security and management of those kinds of problems?
Well, it's really interesting because when we start talking about the cloud, those of us that have been around for a while look back, and the cloud as we refer to it today has existed for a long time. I mean, some of the early days of that were Yahoo Mail and Hotmail and Gmail. These are things where basically, at least for individuals, you were moving your ability to compute outside of your initial environment. It didn't require a whole lot of infrastructure. So we've seen that. As businesses started to migrate to that, the cloud, as we now call it, has developed. But the cloud, when we start looking forward, and probably where we are today, has changed a little bit. Now we look at this infrastructure. So instead of having literally thousands of data centers for companies around the world, we can now start setting requirements. Here's the authentication mechanisms that we need. Here's the ability to patch systems. Here's the ability to do security testing in advance. Here's the ability to sort of build the security around it. Still gives you the access, still gives you the ability to run a business, but actually build it that way. The problem is we have really good standards. We worked on them for a number of years. For example, when I was at the government, Anish Chopra, the president's chief technology officer, Vivek Kundra, the president's CIO, and I sat down working with a bunch of really intelligent people inside the government saying, what are the things we need to do to operate in the cloud? The policy was, as a matter of fact, cloud first. So we came up with 170 some odd controls to protect privacy, to improve security, to save money, to do the economic benefits from it. But not everybody implements those things. So when we look at private sector, and it's a great benefit to a lot of companies to put things in the cloud, we really have to ask some key questions. Look at those, for example, the 170 plus controls that we put together. Look at other groups that have put together sort of the requirements in the cloud and say, here's what I need. Cloud gives me benefits, but I need to make sure you're doing it the right way, because if not, I'm at a disadvantage by moving to the cloud. And I think right now what we see tremendous advantage. We continue to see that and develop better authentication mechanisms, encryption algorithms to make the cloud even more valuable than we see it today.
Well, that leads me to ask you about the Managed Identity project that you oversaw. Can you give us a little insight into how that came about, what it is, where we are in the progress toward that goal?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was called the NSTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. And the fundamental premise for this is we have lived in a society where user IDs and user IDs and passwords are our identity. And 20 years ago, that was probably okay. Number one, we had a few accounts that we had to deal with and manage. There were not so much of the external threats that we would have to deal with looking to compromise that. And nowadays, and I think myself, I'm probably sitting somewhere at about 57 different accounts, considering different emails, different online accounts, online shopping, university work, my old military retirement account. There's so many things, and they're growing. Because as more resources become available, we just talked about the cloud, in order to be able to use those resources require yet another user ID and password. It's been a weak point. It continues to be a weak point, so we decided we have to move away from that. So when we created the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, or the NSTIC, there were some key principles that we looked at. Number one, it has to be driven by the private sector. This is not a government mandate. This is not a government driver's license or sort of a national ID card. This is private sector coming together who can innovate better, who can secure things better, that can work with the government as the government is a customer, but really develop sort of an ecosystem that we need to do strong identity management. The other premise that we had in there was not everybody would need this. We still need the ability to be anonymous in cyberspace. You know, we start looking at things, and I use this as an example many times, and that's Arab Spring. Had they not had the ability to be anonymous and communicating with their peers to be able to overthrow a dictatorial regime, they would have been killed. And while it may not be that dramatic here in this country or in other countries, there's still the ability and our ability to have freedom of speech, which oftentimes goes hand in hand with anonymity. So as a consequence, in the national stretch, the NSTIC, what we have is the ability to remain anonymous if we choose, to have limited identity, for example, if we just need to get something from a bookstore, all the way up to and including having a very, very highly authenticated identity that we may need for travel and passports and things like that. So that's the whole concept. We also are looking for the perspective of having pilots put together, where we set up an office with the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, or NIST, Department of Commerce, to give grants. So to go to private sector and says, hey, you sound like a good idea. Why don't you work together with, say, a small government agency and a corporate piece, so you don't have to have 3 identities. You can use one identity, not only get your, say, your driver's license, but also to buy products online, but also to be able to go out and get some sort of service from there. That's the sort of concept of the NSTIC, and the progress we've made to date has not been as fast as some of us had hoped, because there's some other benefits. I'll use the typical thing we see in cybersecurity when we look at the ability for people to compromise systems: email. We don't have authenticated emails. We don't have the ability to, outside of our organization, to use encryption or S-MIME or those other things to validate who we really are. So that becomes a weakness. And that weakness then allows people to open up a piece of malware, it sort of moves throughout the system, and then that's where we have the problems. If we were just using strong identity in sending of email, that would reduce that, give us better validation that this email is believed who it's from, and we can do that. So we put all these things together. We really need to do this now and be moving a lot quicker.
You mentioned anonymity, and it brings to mind for me the idea of privacy.
Right.
And certainly you've been working in the government and at levels where these discussions have been occurring about the balance between security and privacy.
Right.
This last year has been rife with those kinds of discussions. And so how do you see the privacy problem as we become more and more identified online?
Well, I think first and foremost, many of us understand, and those of us who've been around for a while understand, without security, you have no privacy. You need to do that data protection. You need to have controls in place where you actually control the data. You have the ability to make sure that it's not being used for things that it's not being used for. When we set up the office at the White House, one of the positions that was named in the president's establishment, his office, was a privacy officer. We've had some really good ones. We have a good one in there now. But what happens is that's not enough. We need to make sure we have a full, vibrant dialogue on what are the things that we need to do to protect Homeland Security and national security without giving up the privacy. So I was in Washington, D.C. on September 11th. And a lot of things changed in our society. You know, look at what goes on at the airports, look at a lot of the things that we wind up dealing with, including our ability to communicate. But there's one thing I remember that came over in one of the TV shows that the president done. The president talked about doing better security and protecting the American people, and of course anyone within the border, and like-minded people around the world. But there was something that he said that said we cannot change our level of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and privacy, because then we wind up giving in to those that are looking to impact our society. I've never forgotten that. Mm-hmm. And so while we need to do more to protect the country and to protect our people, we can't do that at the expense of privacy and civil liberties. So given what's been publicized the past few months and things that many of us were sort of always thought, well, something like that went on, never at the level that we look at. Clearly a need to protect our country and to protect our friends, but also not giving up those clear privacy and civil liberty rights that make us what we are today. The discussion is now out in the open. I think it needs to be fostered. I think we need to not have a conversation anywhere, including this conference, where we're not talking about it, to make sure that we understand where those two bump up against each other, and not in conflict with each other, but in support of each other.
I've given some thought about how society has been outstripped a bit by our technology advances, and how few people really challenge the technologies they use. You were involved with some programs at Homeland Security to raise awareness of the general public. How do we deal with that, where people are willing to blindly accept what they see and read on the internet or their involvement with the internet, and yet they do need to have awareness as wise consumers?
What's interesting, in the early days, and this is the 10th year anniversary of Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is very appropriate for this event taking place and supporting Cybersecurity Awareness Month. 10 years ago when we started this, we were just shutting down the office at the White House at the time, turning much of the responsibility over to the Department of Homeland Security. And we established the National Cybersecurity Alliance, basically looking to bring private sector together with the folks in Department of Homeland Security and the rest of government. The initial phases of it, we're doing some education in elementary schools, teaching kids how to protect themselves online. Now we're seeing this internationally taking place, looking at all the aspects of it. Not just small children, but adults, looking at senior citizens, look at inner city people, people that basically are not coming from the background where we are with technology, that we have this sort of innate understanding of what the risk may be. Looking at businesses that are participating so they can help the customer experience be better, to help it be safer. At the same time, what it does for them is makes their business stronger. It almost becomes a competitive advantage there. So when we start looking at the overall program, doing 10 years worth of Cybersecurity Awareness Month, it's great, but it's almost like any specific holiday. It may happen one month or one day out of the year, but we have to live it year round. And that's why this is so important, that the education and awareness piece of cybersecurity is not just a month-long thing. We need to do that year round.
Well, that leads me to ask you about the Centers of Academic Excellence program that has been around for, I guess, over a decade now, and produced at least a couple thousand or more cybersecurity experts who've moved on to interesting positions in government. This has been an opportunity for universities to get involved and to educate people. I'd like to have your views on what you think universities can do more, what their role is, where you see the Center of Academic Excellence movement going.
Well, the Scholarship for Service program, jointly administered by the Department of Homeland Security, National Science Foundation, and National Security Agency, the Information Assurance Division side of it, it's probably one of the things that we first put together that other countries around the world look at us and say, that was a good thing that you guys did. The basics of the program, of course, is universities that adhere to a fairly robust curriculum at all levels, undergraduate, graduate, and doctorate level, to help students prepare for a career in information security, information assurance. Primary focus is the government, because it's a 2-for-1 basis. For every 2 years of scholarship, you agree to do 1 year government service. And a couple things that does, it really helps the government get some new talent, get some new blood in there. Oftentimes people that love the technology but also love the security aspect of it. And even if they don't stay in government, it benefits private sector, because the government, as we talked about a few moments ago, has sort of a unique perspective on doing things. But when you do some time with the government, oftentimes at a higher level than you would come out if you had just graduated from a normal computer science degree, you get in there higher, and if you go to the private sector, you bring this unique perspective. And when we look at the private-public partnership, that's really helpful, because you not only have connections on both ends, but you have a real appreciation for it. So going forward on the Centers of Academic Excellence, I think we're up at about 120 universities now. We've started to focus on some of the universities on the research side. We're looking at 2-year community colleges and everything. So the future, what we need to do is continue to build it. We need to get more people in the existing programs that exist. We need to expand them, because as you pointed out, we've trained a few thousand people maybe, but it doesn't scale. We need thousands and thousands of people. There's discussions just within the U.S. government. In one department, there's at least 1,000 people that they need. This is the key point, I think, where we're getting a lot of the great people that can help us solve these problems, but more importantly, help solve them in an area where it doesn't take as long as it does getting someone to have a career long of solving problems.
Well, the whole question of workforce development is a passionate interest of mine as well. And it's astounding to me what it takes to develop expertise. We used to just find these people. The 12-year-old that was curious and would stay up all night playing around with technology, and you hoped that they hadn't gotten into trouble and that they could be employable in the private sector or in government. But that's certainly not scalable, and I agree that the Center of Academic Excellence approach is not scalable to the degree that we need. You read the Mandiant report and they talk about millions of people coming out of China and other countries, and it's daunting. And you hear about jobs that are going wanting at a time when people are out of work. So from the perspective of the federal government about workforce development, what are your thoughts, Howard, about what we need to do to raise those numbers and move people into what I think are very fine careers?
Well, we for a long time we've talked about STEM. And the idea of STEM is getting more people involved in the sciences. And basically we've seen a little bit of an increase. But when you start looking at some of the statistics that you just alluded to a moment ago, new jobs out there, for every job there's generally at least 3 applicants. For every IT security job, there's 5 jobs for every 1 applicant. We have to reverse that. We have to make sure that we have the people that are capable of doing this. Now, we've done a good job, for example, the Scholarship for Service program, in looking at this from a science and technology perspective. But as we talked about a little while ago, it's much bigger than that. We have to understand the business components of it. We have to understand the international law. We have to understand the defense piece of it. You have to understand the legal piece. There's a lot of pieces to this. So when you have a well-rounded information security professional, they have to really understand all these things, bring them together, and be able to articulate them. So it's just, while the Scholarship for Service programs is great, I support it, I've been involved in it since the very beginning of it, We need to continue to build new things and look at things in a new way. I think it's one of the things that the federal government can do. Look at their own workforce. The Office of Personnel Management did a study, I think a couple of years ago, about 50,000 employees, is what does it really take to be an information security specialist within the government? I think in private sector, we need to ask that same question. We also need to go to our universities and say, here's the skill sets that we need. Here's the things that we need you to teach people so we can get them out in the workforce and develop them. And I fully agree, and we've seen this in private sector a lot of times. Not everybody wants to become the chief security officer, the chief information security officer. They love the technology, they want to stay that way. But we have to equip people to be able to make those choices. Because at some point in their career, you're going to have to make that choice. Do I want to stay straight technologist, or do I want to become sort of part of the management system? The other things that we have to look at in the business schools, and this is one of the interesting things that Tom Ridge and I have been talking about with some of the CEOs and board of directors. Well-trained, best business schools in the world, and of course, right here is one of them. And so as a consequence, when you get in there, do a great job about teaching business risk and financial risk and market risk. But what about cyber risk? And that's the piece we need to start training and equipping the professionals for. And so sooner than later, when they sit in that seat as being the chief executive officer, or they're sitting on a board of directors, so they have all the tools that they need, saying cyber risk has to be part of the business we look at, just like it is in government, and be able to make decisions based on the things that we recognize that are at risk that are going to affect our businesses.
Howard, that leads to a thought about the interdisciplinary nature of cybersecurity. Much of the research, in my experience, has been around the technology, and we certainly need it. But as a colleague of mine in the law school has stated, most of the intrusions that he had to deal with in the private sector when he was in his own practice were people-related.
Right.
And so that seems to be a huge area of potential research and development that we really need to look at. So what are your thoughts about where we are with cybersecurity as an interdisciplinary field?
Yeah, and it's really interesting, and I'll focus on the people side of it for a moment, because that's one that's really been interesting. There was a movie years ago, one of the Indiana Jones, I think it was the Search of the Ark or something, and at one point they were inside this room and there were all these glasses and cups and all these mugs, and they were trying to figure out which one was the one that would, you know, help you do the magical thing you need. And they were trying to pick out which was which. And to me, it's almost the same as we see in cybersecurity today. You know, you get an email from someone and you have to decide as an end user, is this the good one or is this a bad one? And then it's almost like in the movie said when they drank out of the wrong cup and it sort of made the person dissolve, and they say, you have chosen poorly. The same thing applies in cybersecurity. When we look at the end user, first, we have to sort of fix the system so the end user doesn't have to make the decision, is this a good cup or the bad cup? The second thing we have to do is constantly educate people what the threats are. Because in our work environment, as the end user in a university or a business or even a government office, there's some infrastructure there that people support. You know, oftentimes there is a enterprise level, you know, malware protection program and all the things that would help you out. But things get through. We know it. They get through all the time. So the ability to make that decision in an environment, work environment, is a little bit easier. What about your home environment? What happens when you take that mobile device, as we talk about BYOD, bring your own device, when you now are shuttling back and forth between work and home? And if the home system is not secure, if the decisions are made at home actually compromise the security of the system, that translates into work as well. So when you start looking at the threats out there, the end user, consumer, and family members are just as big a target as a business would be. Different benefits for the cyber criminals, but nonetheless, they're target. So we need to make sure that we have an education program, as we have with NICE, the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, going K through 12, university level, end users, to help them make better decisions, keeping themselves secure, but also keeping their computer systems secure as well.
Howard, you talk a great deal about improving education for young people all the way up through universities and then on into the home. There's one area that's interesting to me, and I know it's passionately of interest to you, and that's secure coding practices. And this has been a challenge because we still are producing the same flaws in software that we always have. And so what's wrong with that picture? Now, the ACM is coming out with revisions in 2015 that offer guidance for programs to include security practices. But I know that you've been active in Safe Code, and you've talked a great deal about that problem, which is root cause, and professionalizing the software development industry. So could you explain your activities with Safe Code, your thoughts about this, and where you see us going?
Yeah, it's really interesting when you look at that whole issue, and we talk about software that includes firmware and embedded devices and everything else that run our society on a day-to-day basis. Some of the things we go back and look at, and remember as the software and the IT industry exploded back in the late 80s, early 90s, and especially when the internet became popular for the end users with the World Wide Web back in about 1994, there was this great drive to put more stuff out there, create new things, give people new capabilities in software and in the firmware. The thing is that security wasn't a part of it. Matter of fact, at one time had a developer I was talking with, and we were talking about the buffer overrun and typing in 258 characters and it would break the app. And the person seriously looked at me and said, well, why would someone do that? And the answer is because they can. So that's one of the things that we start to do, and I know when I was at Microsoft, or just when I transited from Microsoft to the White House the first time, we started Trustworthy Computing. Actually shut down for 6 weeks to train the developers how to write less vulnerable code. Now granted, the world is a big place, we're doing a lot of it, and people wind up taking shortcuts. They grab a library that has a vulnerability that's never been fixed, and next thing you know, it's reintroduced. We need to get better at source code analysis. We need to do a better job of looking at fuzzing technology once an application's been compiled. But really will call for a mindset in the way we do things. Oftentimes, our developers get rewarded on how fast they can develop the code, how robust it is, how tight the code is, how portable it is between different platforms. But we need to build in that system as well as part of the reward you get is the more secure it is, making sure you have the business processes in place. And so if you look at Trustworthy Computing and similar programs other companies have had since 2000, 2001, 2003 time frame, and look what Safe Code is trying to do, make that part of the education process. One of the things Safe Code has done recently was take all the members have gotten together and do 6 modules that are available for free, about 30-minute chunks where you can download it. Talks about building authentication into, say, Mac applications or doing buffer overrun reduction in Windows applications. Make it free. It's available for anybody to use, universities or people to use in businesses. And the intent there is to actually bring it up, bring the level up, so whether it's a small independent software company or whether it's a large software house building digital control systems or industrial control systems that were never coded for a high threat environment we live in today, to be reaching a point where we can minimize the number of vulnerabilities we have, which then reduce the number of risks that all of us have.
Microsoft is an excellent example of a company that did a major sea change. And I can say, having taught returning adults for many years during that period of time, I watched the evolution in my students and their awareness of security practices. And you raise an interesting point that people who build things don't necessarily think like the people that want to compromise things. It's a really big difference in mindset. So how would you characterize the adversary community? Obviously there's a different mindset. Have we seen an evolution in that threat spectrum? Where do you see it going? What have you observed in your various positions in the private and public sectors?
Yeah, it's interesting. When you look back at the day, some people asked many of us how we got in information security. Because at one time, this wasn't a curriculum, this wasn't a profession. And the problem was, and what we said was, it's because we love the technology and we've seen other people breaking it, so we need to work to stop that. And so if you take that out to and flip that around to the bad guys, there's all kinds of motivations out there. Number one, there's the financial gain, and that's sort of the early days that we've seen going. I remember the first one I remember seeing back in 1995 or so. I was on AOL, and the first, what we now call phishing email, came out. At that point, it was somebody looking to get your login credentials so they could log in and not have to pay for the service. At that time, it was like $6 an hour and 6 cents a minute over that. So they were just looking for an opportunity to use the technology and not have to pay for it. Later on, as we start to see, and I'm really dating myself, CompuServe, Genie, early days of AOL actually having a connection to the internet, and that basically what we saw, the people then go out there, compromise an account, use that to get out on the internet and hack systems and do all those other things. So the mindset was not taking advantage of it for our own good, but figuring out ways we can use it to get financial gain. Then we start to see a little bit of change when we started seeing economic espionage, as we've seen today, growing into this major issue where nation state versus nation state. We start to see organized crime. But one of the biggest things we've seen, no matter what sector the cyber threats come from, is they're much better organized. They're much better trained. They've learned with the vulnerabilities that we've had over the years how to, prey on the individuals and the weaknesses that humans have, whether it's social engineering, whether it's through an email with a piece of malware attached. They've understood how software is deficient in some areas, and particularly where people don't even patch systems that have been widely recognized for a long time. Recent report came out, I think it was last week, by Kaspersky Labs called IceFog. You go through there, and the exploits were successful because of known vulnerabilities that just weren't patched. So as a consequence, when we see the bad guys out there, they have some pretty rich targets to go after. They're better organized, they do their own research, they collaborate with others, they share the financial rewards with each other, and nation states that are accused of doing these things, they use that to do economic benefit of their companies in there. So we have a lot of different pieces out there that look to exploit those software vulnerabilities that exist. And so all the time when people ask me about what keeps you up at night, is it a nation state, is it cyber war, is it cyber terrorism, is it computer crime, is it organized crime? And the bottom line, what keeps me up is not fixing the vulnerabilities that allow any of those other groups to be successful in exploiting systems.
Then for those in the audience who have a big interest in cloud security management, how would you extend your observations about the bad guys and where they've evolved to this environment in the cloud?
Yeah, I remember, we talk all the time about people rob banks because that's where the money is. The same thing when you start looking at the cloud resources we have. It's all about the information. What we see, what we have, it's all about the information. The cloud is a great repository for that. It gives us tremendous benefits, but it also becomes a bigger target. Because anybody out there that's looking to compromise a system, once again, whether it's a nation state or a cyber criminal, says, hey, that's where all the data is. Let's focus on that. Let's focus on the ability to get in there. And once we get in there, we have the ability to sort of run around unhampered. So as a consequence, it drives all the more reason why the cloud has to be more secure and why we have to make sure that we develop not only the technology, but the business processes to protect what's in the cloud.
So as we move to the cloud, we all of a sudden are having to harmonize legal systems around the world at nanosecond speed. And the challenge of that is rather daunting. I'm certain that you were involved with working treaties with other countries, coming to agreements about what's a crime, what's not a crime, how you harmonize the law enforcement and legal side of things. What are your thoughts about the international law scene and what this is doing to our involvement with other countries?
Yeah, I think the first instance we saw that was about 11 years ago now, when the Council of Europe and the U.S., not being a member of the Council of Europe, we were observers, created the Cybercrime Convention, or the treaty. We oftentimes refer to it as the Budapest Convention, as opposed to the Council of Europe Cybercrime Convention, primarily because when you try to get another nation outside of Council of Europe or outside of the United States to agree to it and eventually ratify it and sign on to it, is they say, wait a minute, we're not a member of the Council of Europe, therefore it doesn't apply. So we refer to it oftentimes as the Budapest Convention to sort of soften that a little bit. But the bottom line is that was our first ability to go out there and do that harmonization of cybercrime laws to make sure we have dual criminality. So if you're committing a crime against the United States from a foreign country, it's a crime in your country, it's a crime in our country, you can be prosecuted in either place of that. That's had tremendous benefits. Even those of countries that have not acceded to it or eventually ratified it, they've sort of fashioned their cybercrime laws with this as a model. So we have a much better ability to say, yeah, unauthorized access into a computer system using falsified credentials or exploiting a vulnerability. It's pretty much a criminal act in most countries. But the biggest problem we continue to have is it just doesn't scale. If you look at the magnitude of some of the things that we deal with, and let's start at the local police department, and just here looking in the Pacific Northwest, King County Sheriff's Office, Seattle PD. I mean, we have great capabilities that have grown up over the years to do computer crime investigations and computer forensics. But what happens when you get a call from someone that's in Tennessee, or you get a call from somebody in the BKA in Germany, or the Met in the UK, or somebody in Thailand saying, listen, we've got this case, somebody's committing cybercrime, and they seem to be coming from your jurisdiction. You just don't have enough people that are trained to go around. So as a consequence, in a lot of cases, the cyber criminals feel they can operate with impunity because you just don't have the ability to do it. So what we're looking at and what we're trying to accomplish, and I know many of the law enforcement agencies do this in the physical world, is how do we create an environment where we're doing cybercrime prevention? Because we'll never be able to stop all the bad guys. We will never have enough trained law enforcement, private sector experts, university experts to help us investigate everything. Mm-hmm. So let's reduce the likelihood that someone becomes a victim. And it goes to part of our earlier conversation. How do people better protect themselves? How do we write better applications and firmware so people can't exploit that and become vulnerability? We've said many, many times, and whether it's a government study or a private sector study or a university study, that says about 80 to 85% of successful intrusions into systems today could have been prevented by good cyber hygiene. So you can imagine the magnitude. If you can reduce cybercrime by 80 to 85%, that gives the limited resources that are available in the law enforcement community, in the private sector security community, a much closer ability to really affect change on that 10 to 15% that are going to be persistent. And those are the things we really need to focus on. Internationally, yeah, we need to get more people focusing on this. The analogy that some of us use oftentimes is it's almost like the money laundering laws that we've seen over time, specifically as it relates to intellectual property. So money laundering days, of course, some of us developed nations had money laundering laws. Some nations actually they participated actively in money laundering because the governments were corrupt. They were able to actually receive personal benefit from it. Other countries, good for the economy, the leadership wasn't corrupt, but they sort of turned a blind eye to it. Mm-hmm. But eventually, I think most nations have recognized money laundering is bad. We need to do the same thing when it comes to theft of intellectual property specifically. We have strong laws, we need to enforce those laws, but other countries have to say, if someone's coming within our borders and stealing intellectual property from another place, we need to go after them, use our resources, all the nation's resources that are available to find that person, collect the evidence, get them to court, prosecute them, and get it to stop.
How much progress are we making towards bringing other countries to the table and agreeing with us that these are indeed major crimes?
Well, we're doing a pretty good job about getting most developed nations to do it. They oftentimes have the resources, they have the legal infrastructure in place, they have the training mechanism in place to do that. But once again, it doesn't scale. So while we have the agreements, we have the interactions, we have really good relationships, it becomes a matter of which of these 20 top 1 priorities do I have to deal with. People that are stealing things, breaking into things, committing homicides, acts of terrorism. All these things have to play, and they have to sort of judge where you're going to put your resources. That's very difficult. So that's those that sort of already have the structure in place. The developing nations are the ones that problem I worry about the most. They oftentimes don't have the legal infrastructure in place. They don't have the training available. In some cases, the citizens are not even aware of some of the things they do are crimes. It goes back to the early days of piracy. Many people would just copy software, not recognizing that this was actually eventually a crime, but at least very most is theft. So basically, as we see those develop, we really have to focus on the developing nations. There's some other things, though, when we look at cybercrime when it comes to developing nations and what other countries are doing. And I'll use the continent of Africa, for example. Tremendous technology being put in that country. I mean, they've got bandwidth and fiber going in, high-speed broadband, being deployed all over the country. But if we don't do it right, we don't make sure that they have the ability to have the legal infrastructure in place, the education and awareness by the end users, I predict that one of two things are going to wind up happening. Either we're going to create another safe haven for every cyber criminal in the world in all these different countries that are part of that continent, or even worse, that we now create a new generation of victims for the people that we're actually trying to help. Because when we start looking at developed nations and what we're doing, we're working really, really hard to better secure our infrastructure. We're doing a better job of preserving what resources we have as family members and businesses, so people aren't just stealing blind from us. And in those cases where somebody does steal some resources, we oftentimes have the resiliency to bounce back. But in developing nations, where basically what they wind up seeing is they wind up losing a year's salary, which is effectively $100, it's devastating for those people. So we really have to help them as much as we do with the developing nations.
How do you see the cloud aiding or complicating the legal prosecution of crime, digital forensics, and so forth?
Well, when you look at the cloud, particularly from a national law perspective, where the data center resides and how the data transits has been something that's really been debated for a long time. I think we have a pretty good idea now that if where the jurisdictions lie, we're a data center operating in the cloud. There's still questions of, say, the origin is in a foreign country and the data center sitting here or in Australia or Germany somewhere. There's some pieces we work through, but as we better understand how the cloud works, the benefits it gives us a better ability to sit there and really push some of these agreements together. That it doesn't make any difference where the suspect or the criminal comes from. If they're affecting a operation in any country, we have the ability to cooperate on it. I think it's still going to continue to be a learning process. We have some good recommendations for nations, but nations operate at different speeds than I think the internet people do.
I'd like to return to the conversation we had a while back about equities and about jurisdictions, because your example of law enforcement going across state or county or local jurisdiction is a good one. And we also have those kinds of issues within the federal government as well. Which agency is responsible for what? And how do we determine that? Because it looks like just about every agency at the federal government level does have a cybersecurity issue they need to work. So I think you've had a lot of experience working in this space. Can you comment about the challenges of working equities and where we may be today?
Well, I know from the U.S. government perspective, when I went back to the White House, the president did a couple things. One, first, this position was dual-hatted, so it had the national security, homeland security responsibilities, but also the National Economic Council side of the House as well. So the ability to look at this not only from the strict security perspectives, but also the economic benefits of it. The second thing was looking at this as an all-government approach. It wasn't as, you mentioned earlier, this sort of the stovepipe way we view things. To be able to go in there and say, okay, this is not just a defense issue, an intelligence issue, homeland, science, technology, commerce, treasury, you name the organization. This is an all-government approach. Everybody would come together in, I think it was May of 2011. We put together international strategy on cyberspace, not cybersecurity, but cyberspace, including some security components. But all the different parts of governments not only came together to create that, but they were also tasked with going to their constituents, if you would, in private sector. So the Homeland Security working with the owners and operators of critical infrastructure, Treasury working with the financial services, Defense Department working with the Defense Industrial Base, bringing all these pieces together. We've seen movement based on some of the things that we did then, meeting with other governments and not sitting down with just their Department of or the Minister of Defense or the Minister of Communication, asking them to bring in all their parts of government as well. So we've made some good progress in that. But at the same token, you see other governments that say, no, this is strictly a intelligence issue or a security issue. And oftentimes the definition of some of the things that we care about are different than other nations. I mean, we cherish freedom of speech. We cherish our privacy. Other countries see some of the things that we take for granted as terrorist talk, or they see it as seditious talk. So as a consequence, their view of that is different than ours. And that's one of the biggest challenges we continue to have today. That we need to make sure that when we start looking at the community and the infrastructure that we've built through the internet, that we have some harmonization, as you mentioned earlier, not only on the law enforcement piece of it, but how do we view this as nation states to protect the privacy and freedom of expression of our citizens, but also be able to provide the economic boost that we need, as well as providing homeland security and national security. It's not easy. And other countries, particularly in the recent months, will look at us and say, wait a minute, you've been preaching this for a long time. Now look what you've been doing the whole time. How are we different? And that's very difficult. It's a very difficult conversation to have.
You're raising a very interesting topic of cultural differences. And we're no longer bounded by oceans. That goes without saying. But those of us who've lived here in the States don't necessarily have a lot of contact with other cultures for any length of time that would impress upon us the vast differences in the way people see things. And so you're raising an interesting challenge. So would you mind elaborating a little bit on what you've seen at the federal government level when you've tried to bring people together to the same table?
Well, it continues to be a challenge in the same vein, because what we look at, things we take for granted, I mentioned a moment ago, freedom of expression. Other governments and other people say, well, why is that such a big deal? You know, I like my government. My government takes me where I want to go. And that may be fine for them. But when we start looking at the internet, what binds us together, the netizens, if we would, it's different. Because what we're seeing is the ability to break down some of those barriers. And I've lived in different countries all around the world. I've traveled. I've met wonderful, wonderful people that basically the government's perspective is diametrically opposed to the things that we believe in. But the great equalizer is the ability to communicate through the internet, the apps that we so love, the social networking piece of it, the ability to conduct business. And so as we move forward, I think we will continue to see the citizens of the countries will continue to push their governments to change. So we talk about the internet culture. The internet culture is relatively new. I mean, it's been 20, 25 years now that we see the internet culture. And if you sort of slice it back to 1994 when the World Wide Web started to become what it is today, that's only a short period of time. So it's going to take some time to get sort of the internet culture to be able to be fostered, to be able to sit there and be accepted in many nations. But I think we're on a good path towards that. I think we can't lose sight of some of the key things we look at, the economic benefits, the privacy, the freedom of expression, the ability to be secure in the things that we do, the interoperability that we look at. We can't lose sight of that as we're sort of figuring out what is the culture of the internet we live in beyond our border cultures that we live in today.
Some in our audience may be aware of a major program that the Canadians have launched and funded UBC, University of British Columbia, to lead around trust. It's a very interesting, high-level academic pursuit where we have academics from around the world looking at the impact on trust in the legal arena, in the journalistic arena, in the law enforcement arena, trust being the glue that keeps a society together. And so I'm interested in maybe your comments on your view of how trust may or may not be impacted by the work you've been doing, by the cloud, by the internet.
Well, it's interesting. It's almost been sort of a pendulum swing. In the early days of the internet, everybody trusted everybody. You know, and I mentioned to somebody, I think the first time I started using what we now call the internet, there were about 35,000 of us on the internet. Now we're what, over 2 billion and growing dramatically, and hopefully more devices and better capabilities we've got. But it was a small community. We pretty much trusted each other. And then as the internet started to grow, it was almost like this inherent trust in it. As a matter of fact, there's many of the things we talked about in the early day. Hey, this is pretty cool. We trust this. It is sort of designed by the people that really care about it. Then all of a sudden the bad things started to happen. And we start to see the pendulum swing the other way where less trust was out there. You know, and the joke was, hey, it's got to be true because I saw it on the internet. And that was done tongue in cheek because we sort of we believed in it, and then we said, now wait a minute, not all that is true. So it's really going to take a lot to build that trust. Right now we have a lot of rebuilding to do with the trust in governments, because governments, with the programs that we've seen talked about recently, the discussion about creating cyber weapons and all the pieces of that that we see out there, there's a lot of distrust. And that distrust basically puts us in a position where we will never be able to reach the full benefit of the internet and cyberspace if we can't figure out how to do that trust. So UBC and the program look into bringing the various segments, the journalism, the private sector, the government together and say, okay, face-to-face trust is not that difficult to do, but when you don't have the face-to-face, how do you really build that? And I think that's going to be a lot of the work we have to do in the future. How can we find out where we can build the trust and sort of push the guys that are looking to compromise that trust, push them off to the side so they don't become of our trusted circles? Oftentimes, we're using just that. We have a small circle over here that overlaps with another circle, and we can need to build it. But it's something that we always have to continue to work to, because if not, we'll never get the benefit of this as we've seen to date.
Well, Howard, I think we've had a real tour de force in talking with you about your experience and your views from the top of the public as well as private sector organizations that are driving the cloud and driving growth in the internet. And we've talked about a lot of things. I'm wondering if there's anything I've missed or if there's any final comments that you might have for our audience. Any thoughts?
Well, I think there's a couple things that I think we really need to be cognizant of, and that's the whole issue about the internet and cyberspace as we know it today that we own. I mean, it's amazing that we each own a piece of cyberspace. So we each of us have to do our part to secure cyberspace, and we all benefit from it. So it's not as if somebody can, here's your job, go fix it, and then come back to it, because we own and operate it. The other thing is that I think we really need to be cognizant of, and that's what governments are doing and nation states are doing, that may actually compromise the benefits we have to this. It's suggesting to make sure that we tell our leaders, not only in the United States, but also around the world, that certain things are not acceptable. This great communications, this great party line, if you would, of our ability to communicate is not something that should be trivialized when it comes to protection of communication, our privacy expectations, all those things. We also need to make sure that cyberspace is used for peaceful purposes, not, as we've seen a lot of discussion about, militarization of cyberspace. And guess what? We're on the front lines of that. So we really need to make sure that we're doing the things we need to do to protect ourselves, to build the trust, but also receive the benefits from it. And lastly, I just want to thank you and the university. I mean, in my own backyard, it's a great resource. I have the ability to tell other people around the world what's going on here, very proudly so. I thank you for spending the time, and the folks that help pull this together at the UWTV, who not only have the expertise, but also the ability to sort of pull this together and help you. So thank you for all your time.
Well, thank you, Howard. Can I ask one final question?
Of course.
Because in the audience we have not only professional people, people from industry and government, we also have students. And of course, as someone who's a professor here at the university, my students ask me all the time what they can do to get themselves prepared. And I'd certainly like your last comments to be to those people that want to chart a course in this field.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, and I probably should have talked about this earlier, because over my career, and I've worked with great people, had some really interesting jobs, but it's always been about the people. You know, none of us can accomplish anything without the help of others, and the same thing applies with the students. And people would ask me, besides riding my Harley Davidson, what I do for relaxation. And part of it's going to the universities, meeting with the students firsthand. because you see the future. You see the excitement they have about how they can do their part, as I mentioned, to secure their part of cyberspace. So a few tips for them. Number one, don't somehow think that just a technology is going to solve everything. You have to really look at this with a very wide aperture to understand all the pieces of it. We've talked about them: the legal, the law enforcement, the business side, the technology side, the human side. All these pieces play into it. The other thing is to make sure that you're willing to change course. And people all the time will ask me, well, how did you go from military to law enforcement, the private sector, to consulting, to all these other pieces of it? And it's because what I did, and I'm not saying this is by any means career advice for everybody, but I was able to go out there and say, this is pretty cool. We need something fixed there. I know people that are really smart at this. Let's get together with them and work on this. Then the third thing for them is to sit there and actually recognize that they receive benefits as well. Because it's easy when you want to go out and fix something for somebody else, but when you look at yourself, your family members, your colleagues, and say, I can help solve this problem, and look at the people that have benefit from it. And then sort of the last thing, and this is sort of the futuristic piece, think into the future. Because as we develop new technologies, or new technologies are developed, here's our opportunity not only see what the things can do, but how someone could break it and keep it from being broken in advance. You do that, and you will have not only a great career, but a lot of fun doing it at the same time.
Well, Howard, I want to thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to express my appreciation for you coming to the university and sharing your thoughts with us, with our audience. It's been an honor and a pleasure to talk with you, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.
Very kind. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.